Welcome back to the Space Now, and I'm your host, Celeste Onorati. And if you're new to the Space Now, thank you so much for joining. So our topic today is, are we living in a virtual reality? And I'm really excited and honored to be introducing you to my special guest, Tom Campbell. Now, I had the privilege of meeting Tom during his 2017 World Tour. A dear friend of mine, Elliot Edge, called me up and he said, Celeste, you have to attend this 2-day workshop in New York City because this is like right up your alley. So I was given this opportunity to log on in person to Tom and his teachings of virtual reality. Who are we here, right? What is consciousness? And does it live inside of this body? Well, these are questions that I've always asked and began inquiring at a very young age, starting with Catholicism and then teachings of the East and philosophy, physics, of course, and metaphysics. And I'm able to share what I've learned through my work as an astrologer and actually to help guide my clients pretty much into their personal and professional life and their goals, like to help cultivate freedom, right? Clarity, peace within them. But most important, I think, is opening the heart to love and to be of service to the world. You know, and astrology happens to be one of the tools that I use to share this knowledge. So my experience within Eastern philosophical traditions has allowed me to understand and find clarity, right, in the root of my suffering, namely the mental mechanisms of the mind that I knew were behind the illusion of that separate sense of self. And in the yoga world, the type of yoga that I started practicing 25 years ago was Advaita Vedanta. Now, Advaita means ignorance. And this is where I came to know that I could not ignore consciousness. You know, that I am not the body, the mind, and that the Atman, or the soul, is pure consciousness. And this could be one way for me to experience it. So Vedanta is a different school. You know, it's a non-dualistic school, and it's very challenging. And it asks the question, is the world false, or is it real in the world of illusion? Does everything just evaporate? You know, the creator, the creation? You know, and sages for a really, really long time always talked about this. You know, form is nothing other than emptiness. Emptiness is nothing other than form. Yet to explain this to someone is not easy. You know, and it can become a contradiction, you know, especially as seen through my studies of this approach. And then when one talks about Newtonian physics, of atoms and particles, and goes further into quantum mechanics, subatomic particles that get abstracted into nothingness, right? Well, it brings us back to, is it an infinite field that is unknowable, or can it be known by our own profound experiences? And if waveforms are spiritual and particles are physical, forms probability, where do they come from, right? And is it duality? Well, Niels Bohr believed them to be both. So, and what about our perception? You know, that comes from our own illusion of reality also, because if we're nothing conceivable or perceivable, learn from my study of Advaita Vedanta from the teachings of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj and other Vedantic scholars, right? I'm like, okay, now meeting Tom. Hey, this opened up another door for me to examine a way to understand this reality and share it with you. So, Tom's experience, his wisdom, and his huge heart is perfect timing for generations that are coming up and this generation now to grasp this way of looking into themselves as he shares and explains it through virtual reality games. That's pretty cool. And I think it's perfect. So who was Tom Campbell? Well, I have to hit my astrology people with this because you're born under the sign of Sagittarius. And the key word for Sagittarius is I understand. You know, so Sagittarius are the eternal students, you know, the scientist, The professor, the traveler, whether it's worldly travel, physical, beyond, and the skeptic. And you always talk about the skeptic. And these are people that are seeking answers to life's mysteries, spirituality, and higher consciousness, right? So who is Tom? Tom is a physicist, a lecturer, and the author of My Big Toe, The Theory of Everything. It's a trilogy of unifying philosophy, physics, and metaphysics, and the origins of consciousness. Now, Tom worked for NASA and the US Department of Defense for over 30 years, Tom. And he learned and practiced transcendental meditation. Yes? Yes.
Yes.
Learned and practiced transcendental meditation, and also worked alongside to Bob Monroe at the Monroe Institute Laboratories, studying consciousness. So for over 40 years as a scientist, Tom has been researching altered states of consciousness by way of out-of-body experiences, remote viewing, to gain insight into the nature of reality and the mechanics of what Tom calls the larger consciousness system. So virtual reality, gaming devices are one of the fastest growing industries on the planet right now, and it's really taking off. You know, so Tom shares and spreads his ideas about consciousness and the nature of reality to the world. And I am so pleased and honored to have him on our podcast today. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. So far, our video, your frame's been freezing for me. So I've got about 30% of the last 5 minutes of what you said.
Oh,
so
no.
it's, yeah, so, but it freezes and then it comes back again and freezes. And I got a little message that says your connection is unstable. So I don't know, I guess we can go ahead and just see what happens. I don't know if my end is freezing up for you or not.
No, it's not freezing up, and I can hear you and I can see you clearly. So it did come up on my end for a little bit that said that it wasn't a strong connection, but I see it's still recording and I still see our picture up. So yeah. I'm hoping that it'll fly, that it'll be okay.
Yeah, Zoom is usually pretty strong. It usually works pretty well.
But I also, I live out in the middle of nowhere, so maybe that might be the, I don't know.
Yeah, usually if it is like that, it's because of the video. The video is the big bandwidth gobbler, and if either one of us probably cuts off the video, then that tends to make it a lot better, because then the audio will be good,
right?
But one of us won't have a picture, so that's a fix for it, but not necessarily a good fix. So let's just try and see how it works.
Let's try. Yes, so far it looks pretty good on my end, but we'll see. So my first question for you is, please share with us how you came to see our consciousness as a virtual reality theory, please.
Okay, well, as you said, I'm a physicist, and I learned transcendental meditation while I was a graduate student in physics, working on my PhD. And I was attracted to it, not because of out of body or anything particularly metaphysical, but because it promised to allow me to get by on less sleep. And that was in the advertisement, you need less sleep. And as a graduate student, that's one thing that really sounds attractive, because graduate students, at least in experimental physics that I was in, we sometimes work 16 hours a day, or sometimes more than that, because once an experiment is running, you have to stick with it day and night and day, and however long. You can't like turn off your experiment and go home, and get a good night's sleep. It doesn't work that way. Right. So I needed something that would help me get by with less sleep. So I went to TM and I learned how to do it, got my mantra, practiced. And a couple of months later, I discovered that I could debug my computer code in my mind by just pulling up the listing of my computer code, and all the lines that had problems in it were red, and the ones that didn't have problems in it weren't. And I was very familiar with it since I wrote the code. I could tell what every line was and where it was. So I found out it worked. Sure enough, those were the lines that had problems in it. This is back in the bad old days when you had boxes of cards, to run a program. It's not like today. Debugging then was a very long and tedious process, because you only would get maybe 1 or 2, if you were lucky, runs on the computer a week. So if you had a problem, if you had 2 problems, you just lost a whole week's worth of work.
Right.
Just because you had a bug, just because the key punch had punched your card a little off center. That's all it would take, and you could lose a week of work. So you really had to go over and over and over your software to make sure it worked. Otherwise, you'd never get anything done.
Wow.
So this idea of debugging in your mind was just a magnificent, like 1,000 to 1 advantage as far as debugging code. And before that time, I was like most physicists. If you can't measure it, it's not real. That's sort of an attitude.
Right.
Only things that are measurable are things that are real things. Things that aren't measurable, well, you just don't know about them. They're either imaginary, or they're not really important, because if you can't measure them, you can't interact with them. And if you can't interact with them, then they're not important. So that was the reality that I lived in. But once I could decode my program in my mind like that, I knew there was something else to reality besides the physical. And there were important things going on you could not measure that had real significant results, like a code that was debugged was the result. But the process was obviously non-physical. So that changed my whole thinking about reality. And it opened me up to new possibilities. So a few years later, when I got out of graduate school, I had an opportunity to meet Bob Monroe. Bob Monroe's the guy that wrote Journeys Out of the Body, Far Journeys, and Ultimate Journey. A guy who had out-of-body experiences, scared him to death. He wanted to quit having them. He was terrified he was going insane, couldn't quit having them. They had them anyway. So he decided just to play with them and see what they did. And he wrote this book, Journeys Out of the Body, which is like a diary of his experiences in this out-of-body state. And he did enough things out of body that collected evidence that what he was doing was real. He really could find out what was going on other places, like remote viewers do. He really could interact with things and make a difference. So he knew that it was real because he had real evidence that it was real. So he wanted to study it, and he has had a lab. So he had, myself and another guy, an engineer, Dennis Menrick, we became his scientists. He had just built this lab. So the deal was that if he taught us to do out of body, we would be his free scientific help. So that was the deal, and he agreed. And within probably a year and a half, Dennis and I were able to go out of body at will. Bob was a pretty good teacher, so it really wasn't that hard. And we both were able to do that whenever we wanted. And we were putting like 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe. That was our night job. And then we were putting in like 50 hours a week, in the day job doing physics, and him doing, double E, electrical engineering work. So that was, and that went on for almost a decade. So there's a lot of hours here. So I'm not talking about we meditated a few times and, figured it all out. We're talking about a lot of hours of practice going into this. So I'm a physicist, and what physicists do is try to model reality. That's the job of physics, model reality. That means understanding how reality works, why it works that way. What are the constraints? What are the limitations? What can be done? What are the possibilities? So that's what I started to do with this new reality that I had discovered, because here I am, a physicist, and I found there was another whole piece of reality that I didn't even know about. So I had the incentive to go find out. So once I started working with Bob, that was the beginning of my plan to go find out. And about 35 years later, after a lot of experimenting, and I was able to do science, I was able to do physics in the non-physical, because I could repeat the experience. I could repeat the altered states very precisely by then. So I could go to the same place in the same way and do the same things, except maybe change one variable and see how that changed the result. So you do that 50 times and you begin to understand the relationship between that variable and the result that you get. And then you do it another 50 times with another variable until you find out what, that variable, how that affects the result. So I did this, and it took a long time, 35 years, and I'm studying basically how consciousness works from inside of consciousness, not from outside. It's not looking at somebody else's consciousness or even looking at my own. It was from being free, if you like, a free agent inside the larger consciousness system. So I eventually thought I understood consciousness. And I wrote these books, and the books were, in my mind, really a theory of consciousness. But because because I knew that consciousness was fundamental and that the physical world was not. The physical world was a derivative from consciousness. So I call it a theory of everything because I knew everything fell out of consciousness, that once you understood consciousness, everything else was a subset. But at the time I published them, which was 2003, I didn't really understand how to make the connection with physics very strongly. So I said a few things in my book about it, but they were very general. I knew there was a connection there to make, but it just didn't dawn on me exactly what it was. And then about 2 years after they'd been published, somebody was having a conversation with me over email about a different subject altogether, and it just rang the bell, one of those aha moments. And suddenly I saw quantum mechanics. I said, hey, the same principles that I'm using to describe consciousness explain quantum mechanics. Well, of course, that's a big deal because physicists can't explain quantum mechanics. They call quantum mechanics weird science, unexplainable. It's just nothing that you can't deal with it logically. You can only deal with it mathematically. And it doesn't seem to make any sense. But I saw that it did make sense from the perspective of consciousness. Then I started looking about, well, what else? If quantum mechanics falls out like that, what about the other big thing in physics, which is relativity? Quantum mechanics and relativity are basically physics these days. They're the big, the two big monsters in physics. So I looked at that, and it didn't take long. Within just a day and a half, I had the answer for that. Of course, speed of light has to be a constant, and that's the key thing for relativity. If that's the assumption, and nobody knows why the speed of light ought to be a constant. Nothing else is a constant, but it is for some mysterious reason. And Einstein started with that assumption. Well, let's just assume that it is constant. Then out comes relativity. You say it's based on that fact, but the fact was a big mystery. Well, from the view of understanding consciousness, you can see that every virtual reality must have an upper speed limit. That's basically 1 pixel of distance for every 1 pixel of time, because it's a pixelated, it's a calculated reality. So my viewpoint when I wrote the books, I came to the conclusion probably a year or so before I published them, maybe 2 years. It took me about 5 years to write. But a couple of years from the end, I realized that the one idea that pulled it all together was that consciousness is information. And that makes pretty good sense if you think, what are you conscious of? What are we conscious of now? Well, it's all our sense data, and our sense data is just information. So if you took away your 5 senses, what would you be conscious of? Well, it would be like a Descartes moment. It would be, I exist, therefore I am. That's all you'd have. You wouldn't have touch, you wouldn't have any smell, you wouldn't have any of those things. All you would have is that I exist. You would exist in a black void. That would be your reality if you lost your sense data. So consciousness is information. And once I got that, everything, this theory I was trying to pull together, I was trying to write about, I had all of these pieces, and every piece I knew was an important piece, but I really didn't know how to pull them all together into a coherent theory, which is the reason I was writing the book in the first place, because when you write something down, you have to be precise and it has to be coherent. Otherwise, all those little things that you just kind of slide over, they bite you when you have to write it down.
Right.
So I realized that when I got that, that was the thing that pulled everything together. As soon as I saw that this was an information system and all the pieces snapped together like this giant jigsaw puzzle, and everything made sense. So that's kind of how I got here. And I didn't get here through Eastern philosophy. I didn't get here through reading a whole lot of what other people thought about the world or how it worked. I basically got here on my own, you know, trying to figure things out and doing a lot of experimentation. And of course, growing up a lot on the way, because when you're in these paths, you just naturally tend to grow up and you start to realize what's important and what's not, and so on. So all that kind of came together, and I realized that my theory of consciousness really was a theory of everything, and I could explain physics better than physicists could explain it, because it wasn't just those two things. I looked for all the paradoxes in physics, and there was dozens of paradoxes in physics, from obvious things like you know, the Big Bang Theory. Well, where did that ball of plasma come from to start with? Okay, we know that it expanded, and once it expanded, it cooled, and we got suns and planets, and yeah, fine, but where did that first ball of plasma come from, you see?
Right.
And physicists say, well, you know, our physical reality is all the reality there is. Well, our physical reality didn't exist, you see, and that ball of plasma did, because we evolved out of it. So that's one of the, you know, it's just an example of a paradox in physics, but there were literally dozens of these paradoxes, and every single one of them just fell open to a solution once you see it from the viewpoint of virtual reality. That is, reality is information. That's another way of saying a virtual reality. It's a computed reality. Reality is information. And the interesting thing that happened was that in 2003, when I published those books, there were maybe 3 people on the planet that thought virtual reality was an intelligent idea, and everybody else thought it was really crazy. But now that's changed a lot, because modern physics keeps telling physicists, you know, it's information, guys. That's the only way you can, you know, it's the only way you can solve the problem.
Right.
And so scientists are getting that now. So virtual reality is a pretty big thing in physics departments all over the world. I'd say 20, 30% of physicists out there would tell you virtual reality is a real subject to study. You know, it's an idea, it's a concept in physics that is a valid thing to work on. Whereas that's just a decade ago, almost nobody would have said that. Everybody would have laughed at it and said that's a ridiculous idea. So it's not because it's a trend, it's not because it's a fad, it's because their experiments are dragging them to this conclusion, kicking and screaming. They don't want to go to virtual reality, because virtual reality is scary to physicists. Because what that says is that our reality, our physical reality, is a subset of something more fundamental than us, and it's non-physical to us. You see, that's just logic, because a virtual reality can't compute itself. You know, if you are in the World of Warcraft, the virtual reality game, well, the computer that computes it can't be inside the World of Warcraft. It's got to be outside. So the consciousness that plays the avatar, that plays the elf, also has to be outside of the physical reality, because it has to be in the same place as the computer, because the player and the computer have to be in the same reality, because they're trading information all the time. So now we have the consciousness and the computer are non-physical to us. We're avatars in a virtual reality simulation. Now you see, that's a really big leap for most people to take. But not only does it answer all the paradoxes and understanding, you know, in physics, but it answers all the questions in metaphysics, and it answers most of the questions in theology and a couple of other fields. You know, things that don't sound like physics, like why are we here?
Right.
You know, what's our purpose? Those kinds of things are philosophy issues. So it solves lots of questions all over the place, and really did turn out to be a theory of everything. So that's kind of how I got here. But what it does now is it unifies physics, metaphysics, philosophy, and theology. All those things now become all understandable as one bigger thing. And that one bigger thing is consciousness. And once you understand how consciousness works, the rest of that stuff in all those fields becomes transparent, becomes perfectly clear. You know, what the Buddha meant when he said that, you know, our physical reality was maya, you know, was an illusion.
Right.
Well, that's poetry. Yes, that's poetry, and you have to interpret that. Well, just what does that mean? And in your monologue when you started, you came up with a couple of things like that. Well, yeah, okay, that sounds cool, but what does that really mean?
Right.
You see? Well, before, a lot of people have understood the bigger picture all through the ages. Thousands of people have done it because that's the exploration of inner space. You don't need any technology to explore inner space. All you need is time and an inclination. So there's been people like the Buddha and hundreds, thousands of others perhaps that have understood the bigger picture, but it's always been expressed in terms of poetry, in terms of experience, in terms of metaphor. So the thing that's really different about mine isn't that I say things that are vastly, different from what the Buddha said, but I say them as science. It's a logical derivation. It's not poetry. We start with this assumption, which is consciousness exists and that evolution exists. And after that, it's all deductive logic all through the rest of it until you get to solving physics problems. So that's the difference. And the reason that it's happening now, the reason I was able to do it is because I'm here at the right time. Right. You see, the Einstein and the Buddha didn't have concepts of, virtual reality and quantum physics and that kind of stuff. So they just didn't have the conceptual things to work with that actually solves the problem. But today, 21st century, all the conceptual stuff comes together into one place. And now you can see how all of it fits together in a scientific, logical way. So that's kind of the the nutshell, and the whole thing in a very short summary of kind of what it is, why I'm here, what it's all about. Skipped over most of the details, but that's the core of it.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'm happy, to see this at this time too, because 25 years ago, exactly, like even when I was seeking and searching for answers, we didn't really have access to a lot of information. So you had to really go within yourself to try to figure it all out. And you knew that science and spirituality had to be connected in some way. And when would it finally happen? When will this finally happen? So when I was able to sit in on your workshop, I was like, yes, finally, So what are the percentages of physicists today that are actually chiming in with this and understanding it? Is like, can you give an idea of where we are with that right now as far as?
Yeah, I can. And hopefully it's going to change a lot in the near future. I'd say that, like I said, about 20–30% of physicists think virtual reality is correct. The particle physicists no longer say things like an electron's a little chunk of mass with a charge. Right. They've given that up because they can't get right answers if they use that as their assumption. They say an electron is a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge, you see, which is the way that you would describe something in a computer. It's information. It has attributes. It's just information. It's not really a thing. Things don't exist. You see, they only the appearance of things exist. So that's fairly big in physics right now. The idea that this is an information-based reality. But scientists are very, very slow to connect that virtual reality with consciousness, or to even connect that virtual reality with having to get rid of materialism. So they come up with all sorts of really bizarre ways of kind of getting around the problem, trying to define things other ways, because they don't want to go to that place where we're a subset of something else that's non-physical. That sounds like back in the old days when the high priests were really priests and not scientists like they are today. So that is scary to them down at their, very basic belief level. They cling to materialism like like they were 4 years old and that was their favorite teddy bear. Right. That gives them kind of peace and solace and makes them happy to cling to materialism. And they have all of their lives invested in that belief. So as you can imagine, it's a little difficult to get them to see it any other way.
Right.
But we're working on that. And I presently have a set of experiments. There's actually like 17 or 18 experiments, but I've broken them into like 5 groups that are quantum mechanics experiments. And they demonstrate pretty clearly. They produce a lot of evidence for this being a virtual reality and for consciousness, being the computer. So these experiments I'm trying to get done, and that will change everything. And my first step in getting them done was to present them all. I did that in 2016 to a group of people in LA. And then my second step was to take that explanation, which was at everybody's level. It wasn't for physicists, it was for everybody. I did it at a level that everybody can understand. And that's another thing, that's a little side issue here, but when you actually understand something that's fundamental, it's simple. It's not complicated. You can explain it to people, who don't have math backgrounds. You can explain it to anybody. The real fundamental things are simple and elegant. They're not complicated. If you need 5 pages of math to understand something, it's not fundamental. You see, you know that right away. It's just not fundamental. So I did it the first talk was to everyone on an every person level. And then afterwards, I took a handful of those experiments, put them in the right format for a physics paper, and had them accepted in a peer-reviewed journal called Quantum Foundations, Journal of Quantum Foundations, I think it's called. So that was last summer. I had that done. So we're not quite a year into that yet. And now I'm trying to raise some money to get the experiments done. So when these experiments get done, and if they work the way I think they'll work, then that will kind of light a fire under physics, you see, to change their mind about this materialism thing, because materialism just fails and fails to even, to talk about these experiments, much less explain them. So I think that will set a fire, will start some things moving that isn't moving now. So to answer your question, there's lots of physicists that think virtual reality is a good idea. This is an information-based society, but there's probably very, very few that would say that they agree with me that consciousness is the computer, that we are individual units of consciousness playing avatars here and the rest of it. But that's the only thing that makes sense. You see, I have not only my experience and the things that I've read and the people I've met, but it's also my 35 years of being in other reality frames. I've got all that too. So I know a lot of data points that have to be hit. It has to explain A, B, C, and D in the non-physical, as well as, E, F, G, H, and I, J in the physical. And this particular theory gets them all. It basically explains all of my experience, both as a physicist and as a consciousness researcher. So
this is exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah.
So are you
you'll
open up these experiments once they're done, and you get the people that are going to help you get this going available for everyone? You'll tour.
Oh yes. Yeah, they're all available. The experiments right now can be read by everybody. They don't take a degree to read them. They're just given to you in logic. And that's, if you go to my Google, not Google, my YouTube page. Go to my YouTube page and do a search on MBT-LA, and that's my big toe, Los Angeles, and that will come up, and you'll have like 7 hours of video or so. It's a lot, but it explains all these experiments, and it does the lead up, the virtual reality, and what it means, and how do you know that this is a virtual reality? Some of the ways that you can show that it's virtual. And at the end of it, the last maybe 3 or 4 hours are just laying out all the experiments. So that's available to anybody right now. And when we get these done, what we want to do is, and I'm starting a Kickstarter program in a month or two that's going to try to raise the funds to get these experiments done, because academia, like every place else, money talks. They're busy, they're working on their grants and whatever else they have to work on, and they're not just going to stop that to do yours for free. Life just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. So we're trying to get some money, and we'd like to get enough money that we could also do a documentary film of the whole process, so that people will be able to see where the process, went all the way from talking about them in California at LA in 2016 to the actual experiments being done and all the steps in between, and that sort of thing. So we'd like to do that at the same time if we get enough, if we can raise enough funds in the Kickstarter.
That's exciting, and I'm sure that's going to happen because there's more and more people that are really tuning into it and want to know. And I think it's great. It's a great way for you to be able to share this information with the rest of the world. I love it. I really love it a lot.
Yeah.
And
So
I did some experiments with you when I took the workshop, which I thought were really, really cool. Like just to be in a room with everyone and go through a couple of these experiments was mind blowing, you know, to see how close people could come to using their not their intellect, but their beingness, their, you know,
yes.
intuition and grabbing onto something that is beyond anyone's idea of comprehending, you know, something that we can tap into. We all have it, you know. So, and how do we do it?
And the most amazing, the most amazing part of that is how easy it was.
It was easy.
You see, there's a whole room full of, there's a whole room full of people. We don't meditate. We don't relax first. You know, I don't explain anything about it. We just say, oh, we're going to do some remote viewing today. And I got a picture here. Tell me what it is. And we find that at least 35% get it really well. And probably 70% get part of it. And that's just stone cold people who, you know, happen to be sitting in the room. And the big thing about that is it's not hard.
No.
It's really easy to do. All you have to do is get out of your intellect, learn how to get the noise out of your mind, and focus your intent. And there it is. Yes, you get better with practice, but it's not a hard thing to do.
No. And you know, and when I talk to people and clients about meditation, you know, I always had a hard time with meditation because it was always like a group kind of thing, and that you had to do it at a certain time. And I was like, wait a minute, you know, this makes no sense to me. You know, it shouldn't be a start or stop kind of thing. You know, if you're going to do it 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes at night, what do you do for the other 17 hours? Where did you go? You know, so me, the whole understanding of meditation was just be here. You know, that's meditation, you know, and whatever it is you're doing, you're in it, you're doing it, you know. And so, and I came to understand that it opened up my, clairvoyant, if you will, psychic senses, even that much more, because when you have the understanding of the awareness of being, and also opening up the heart, that has a lot to do with it. This information is easy to access. And so, you know, people say to me, you know, like, where do you get this information from? You know, I used to say to them, the Akashic, you know, but then I'm looking at it, I'm saying, well, the Akashic is no different than the larger consciousness system.
Right.
It's coming from somewhere. I don't really care where it's coming from, but it's coming, you know, and can I see it? Sure, I can get a visual. I get visual. I get audio. You know, can we access people that have passed? Sure. You know, like, I don't knock on their door. They'll come into me, you know, because like, it's just, we all have this. So, meditation to me is, when you do sit down and meditate, then you understand what meditation is, you know. But to people say, well, how often do you meditate, Celeste? And I go, all the time. You know, like, it's constant meditation, you know.
When I'm asked that question, I say, well, it's one of two answers: either zero, I don't meditate at all, or my life is a meditation. I meditate all the time. I'm in a meditation constantly, and that's where I live.
Right.
You know, you don't have to go do something special all the time. That's for beginners. When you first learn, the discipline is probably necessary for you to learn and do that, to quiet your mind, get rid of the noise. But once you do that, the mind is a very powerful thing. You know, sometimes people will say, well, I just can't meditate, and I've tried and it doesn't work. And I say, well, can you daydream? And they say, sure, I can daydream. And I said, well, there you are. You got it. All you need to do is daydream, and it'll work just as well. Because you see, in your daydream, you let go of the physical world. You're no longer processing the stuff here. You're off in some other, all you have to do is take charge of your daydream. You know, it's it's all the same thing. There's nothing magic about meditation, and we make it hard because we kind of build it up as some kind of almost magical thing. But it's simple. It's just
Right.
being at one with who you are.
It's who you are. Yeah, and you know, and everything gets tied into that, because when you think about Hollywood and you think about the yoga world, you know, and you think about all the bull that's attached to it, it's just like, come on, what are you guys doing with this stuff, you know? Or you know, you meet someone, well, your chakras aren't in line, you know, and like, you know, this is what you need to do, and it's just like, wow, where are you getting this from? You know, and a lot of times these people that call themselves healers that know this stuff aren't even healed themselves, really. And when I say they're not healed themselves, is that you know that they're not living in the space of now, this awareness, if you will. I call it awareness. I don't call it the space of now. I don't say living in the moment, because you can't do that anyway, you know, but it's just an awareness of your beingness. And so why would I want to go to a massage therapist or a healer that doesn't really have that understanding? How are they going to be able to tap into that beingness at that moment if they're not understanding how to be in it all the time, or how to be aware of being in it all the time?
Yeah. Well, it's like this. They can, with practice, they can harness their being level energy to do very specific things, kind of at specific times under specific circumstances. You know, they have to have all the right props and all the right things going on, you know, and
Right.
then they can do this, and they can be somewhat effective at it. They can heal, and they can do things.
Yes, of
So
course.
it's not that they can't be effective. It's just that they could be so much more effective and do it so much with less complication, with
Right.
less story, with less props, you know, with less requirements, if they were just like you say, you know, holistic. If they were connected to everything all the time,
All the time.
then it would be an easy thing, and they would find that they could do it with half the amount of trouble and half the amount of effort. But they can be effective if they practice and focus on things. And often people don't grow up all together. You know, parts of them are grown up and other parts not so much. You know, people don't grow up uniformly across the board in all ways. They learn certain lessons and kind of grow some there, but other lessons, they're not quite ready to grab hold of those yet. So
Right.
it's a very mixed bag. That, yeah, I run into people, and some of them have wonderful talents, but they have a lot of things yet they haven't learned too.
Right.
So it's a mixture. People will just, you know, it's just like growing up as a, you know, as a human being, you know, and from being 10 years old to being 30 years old. You know, some people are really grown up some ways and still children in a lot of other ways.
Mhm.
And
There was one of the things that you talked about in your book, you know, the process of developing and evolving an awareness, you know, which I really liked. And you said, you know, it's the same for everybody, for all entities. Some are much brighter, some are dimmer, you know. And when you talked about that, I also talk about it when I do an astrology chart. I'm able to look into the chart wherever the information comes, and it allows me to see what they inherited so far in this lifetime, and maybe what they brought over again, you know. And these are environmental. We inherit our environment growing up, and so they're learned conditions. And you talk about that, you know, such as our ego, our beliefs, and our fears. You know, fears is a big one. I always try to talk to people about their fears, you know. So you know, what way can you subscribe one to overcome these false beliefs and limitations and develop, as you say, a higher quality? And you use the term lower entropy consciousness. So what are some of the ways that you can subscribe one to overcome?
okay, well, a lot of people have difficulty even being aware of their fear. You know, many people will deny that they even have any fear, or that they have any fear that's very important, when they're just full of it, but they don't know it, you see. And the same with belief. People will deny that they really have any beliefs, because whatever it is you believe, you don't believe it as a belief, you believe it as certain knowledge. So you don't really see it as a belief. But so out of the fear, belief, and ego, belief and fear are hard to see in yourself, easy to see in somebody else, but hard to see in yourself. But ego now is different. Ego is easy to see. And the way you see ego is anytime that you have any negative feelings, anytime you feel stressed, anxiety, anger, you know, disappointed, unhappy, annoyed, all of those negative feelings, that's your ego.
Right.
And if you didn't have that ego, you wouldn't feel any of those negative things. Your life would just be full of joy and happiness, and you'd smile all the time. But because you have ego, you have these negative things that happen in your life where you get upset by things, you get annoyed by things. And each one of those annoyances, each one of those negative feelings is attached to a fear. So you can trace that ego reaction, that negative reaction, back to a fear. What fear, makes me feel this way, makes me nervous, makes me upset? What fear makes me angry? Because see, you don't have to be angry, and you point your finger at somebody else and say, well, they make me angry. They don't make you angry. You choose to be angry. You could be other things. You
Right.
wouldn't have to be angry. It's your choice. You choose to be angry because you have fear, and they trigger your fear, and the fear, boils up its ego, and the ego, expresses anger. And that's what's going on. So if you want to find your fear, look for your negativity, your negative feelings. Every one of those is attached to a fear, and many of them even to the same fear. Trace them back, be honest, don't point your finger at anybody else for the cause. They're not. You find the causes in yourself, and that will lead you to your fear. And once you get to your fear, first thing you have to do is own it. Okay, that is my fear. I am that way. The second thing you have to do is look and see how that fear has informed your choices, over the last decade or over the rest of, over all your life, all the choices you've made, all the things you've done, the things you've said, you've gone left instead of right, all the choices. And how much has your fear been the reason that you've done that? And if you're honest, you'll probably find that 80, 90% of all your choices were made because of your fear. Your
Right.
choices of what to say, your choices of how to react, all of that comes from your fear. So then you realize that fear is really running your life. That fear is the thing making your choices. Fear is what's choosing your choices from your free will, and that should be enough to make you want to get rid of it. The way you get rid of it then is there's two really good techniques. One of them is you use your intent. You have to focus your intent on getting rid of it, and you have to really want to. If it's intellectual, like, well, I think I should get rid of this fear, nothing will happen. You have to really want to, at a being level, get rid of it. And if you do, when you feel that anger or that negativity kind of welling up in you, you just kind of talk to yourself and say, stop it. I don't want to feel that. I'm not going to feel that. Now, you're not trying to change your behavior. That's not the point. Changing your behavior will make you more civilized and nice to be around, but it's not going to help you grow up. You got to change who you are. So it's not that you learn how to suppress the anger, it's you learn how to not have it, you
Right.
see? And you do that just by rejecting it when it comes up and says, no, I'm not like that. I'm not going to feel that. And you refuse it. And you'll have to do that a couple of hundred times before you'll notice that it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Because just your intent by itself, you see, will get rid of the fear. Your intent modifies future probability. Things happen, in the future. Their probability of happening depends on your intent and everybody else's intent. So if you have that strong intent to get rid of that fear, you will get rid of that fear. And you will just keep working on it until it goes away. The good news is, well, let's do the bad news first. The bad news is it's not as easy to do as it is to say.
Right.
And it may take a long time. And that first major fear may take you a year or 2 years before you get rid of it. But everyone after that is a lot easier. So if
Mhm.
the first one takes you 2 years, the second one maybe only take you 2 months. And after that, you can probably throw them off in a week or two. You see, you get much better at offloading this junk because you know how better you feel once you get rid of it. Like a big load has just come off of you and you're a different person now. And you truly are a different person. If all you do is suppress it and cover it over and deny it, you're not a different person. You're just trying to act like a different person, but you're not really a different person. And that doesn't help you grow up.
And a
So
lot
that's how you get rid of fear.
and a lot of people cover this up with oh my gosh, all kinds of things, from alcohol to drugs to anything that can numb that. And again, it's suppressing what's happening. So it takes time for
Mhm.
you to take a look at what these fears are. And, you know, when I have a client come for the first time and I'm trying to gently open up to show them what some of these fears might be based on what they've inherited, and I say to them, you know, it could be maybe a year or two. It's like, oh my God, you just told them something that's like so drastic. You know, what do you mean a year or two? You know, to get through this, you know, this will be a time period, you know, where you're really going to have to take a look at yourself, and this is what could happen in the next year or two. But you need to work on it, you know. And so when you give them that kind of time frame, they freak out, you know. So, but it's so connected what you're saying and what I do with my work and how I share this with people. That's why I think it's so important for us to have this conversation today. Getting another perspective of someone who I have, you know, have a lot of respect for you and what you've done so far in your life and how you're sharing what you're sharing. But it's so true. But and then there are these people too that, I mean, I didn't know whether I wanted to go down this road with you, but I do want to go down it because I think it's very important. During your time of studying consciousness, there was also that whole group that came out in the 60s, you know, with LSD, you know, psychedelics. And I know a lot of these people in that field. And, you know, I didn't take that route, but I know people that have, and I know people that are still stuck with it and still believe that it can be an open doorway to examining your consciousness. But I try to share with people that it's like a Band-Aid. It's like just it's not something that's going to last. You know, it's going to give you an insight, but it's not something that's going to be permanent. You know, why would you want to do that? Why don't you, you know, practice a little harder and look within yourself and gain access that way? So in the 60s, there was that whole group of people that experimented with this. And the thing that's sad for me today is that seeing a lot of these kids that are looking forward to that kind of an experiment, you know, and thinking that they're going to gain access to a beautiful life through that form of intent, if you will, intending that it's going to help them see themselves better. But so, and I was hoping that maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure,
Please.
absolutely. My experience is like yours. I rejected all of that. In my viewpoint, my mind was my, you know, my awareness in my mind was the core of my existence, and I didn't want to mess with that by sticking drugs in it that would change it around. If I couldn't get there on my own, then, you know, I wouldn't go. It was that sort of thing. So I avoided that. But the way it works now that I see it from a bigger picture is that the drugs give you an experience, but you don't grow up from experience.
Right.
You grow up from choices. You have to make choices. So, you know, you can get on a roller coaster and have an experience. And if the experience is really wild and fun, you can get back on it again and have another one. But eventually you get kind of tired of it because you keep going around that same roller coaster over and over again. You know, it's not so exciting anymore. And it kind of loses its impact, but they're just experiences. It doesn't change you. It doesn't make you a different person.
Right.
Now with the psychotropic drugs, it often makes you think that you're a different person because you take a psychotropic drug and you see that we are all one. That's one of your experiences. You see that everybody is one thing, that we're all part of this thing, and that love is the answer, and we're all connected, and all that is shown to you in a great picture. All right, good. Now, does that help you become love? No, it doesn't. Now you have an intellectual concept. Well, you could have gotten that intellectual concept out of reading a book, and it would have taken you just about as far. You see, you're not going to grow up with drugs any more than you're going to grow up from reading books. And there's some people that feel they want to grow up from reading books. Oh, I've got this problem. I'm unhappy. What I need to do is read a lot of books and I'll be better. I'll understand things. Well, that's in your intellect. It has nothing to do with growing up. Growing up is being a different person. You have to change yourself to be somebody other than who you are now. And just reading a book, you know, any book won't do that for you. You have to be it, not do it. And the drugs allow you to experience it. They allow you to understand it, but they don't help you be it. And if you don't be it, you're not grown up. but they feel grown up because they've experienced it. Okay, they've experienced this thing with one, and that makes them maybe a little more mellow now, and they start seeing themselves and other people as more connected. But most of that's going on in their heads, you see. And
I
they
agree.
may even feel warm and fuzzy at the heart too, but warm and fuzzy isn't going to help you grow up. It's nice to develop that empathy and that connection with other people, but that's not enough to make you grow up, you see. That is a result of growing up, not something that you do out of your intellect. So the drugs just don't work as something that will help you become more spiritual. They will help you have experiences, but you have to live that experience. You have to make that experience part of your choice, part of your life. Otherwise, it's not going to help you any. And the thing I've seen with the people who take drugs a lot, I should say one thing, and that is I've talked to some people who said, I took drugs once or twice. I saw how much there was to learn, and I never took any more, and I started to study. And for them, the drug was a good experience. It was a helpful, useful experience. But that's the only helpful, useful experience that I've ever seen really come out of drugs. And that is, if it gets you the idea and gets you motivated, and then leave it alone, all right, I'll check that off as a good experience from taking a drug. But if you continue to take them because you want to continue to have those experiences, it's like getting back on the roller coaster because it's such an exciting trip. What happens is that you begin to believe that you are a more spiritual person. You begin to believe that you're a deeper person. You begin to see that yourself as differentiated from others. And you start hanging out with other people who take drugs.
Right.
And you start seeing the straight world as being full of problems and issues and anger and stuff, and that you and your druggy friends are nice and calm and whatever. And you begin to drop out. You disconnect from the larger reality, and you and your friends kind of hang out together, and you do your drugs, and you lose interest in your job. You lose interest in, your responsibilities, and you start to just kind of float through existence from experience to experience. Well, that may sound like somebody who is becoming more evolved. They're becoming like a monk. They just want to sit in the cave and have experiences. But no, that's not the way you grow up at all. You grow up through making choices, and where the choices are out there in that real world with all its misery and dysfunction and nastiness. That's where you have to make the choices. That's where the rubber meets the road in choice making. You see, you and a bunch of like-minded friends all kind of staying together and making fun of the rest of the world. That's just arrogance from kind of an inside view rather than outside view, and it's not going to teach you anything. Actually, it's going to make it worse for you, because now you feel like you are evolved and you have a lot of quality of consciousness and you're a very spiritual person, but it doesn't run very deep. Because you take one of those people out of that community and put them out in that rough and tumble world, and right away, anger,
Totally.
annoyance, fear. You say, well, a spiritual person doesn't have any of that fear. A spiritual person can work and be in that world, and they have compassion, not fear. You see, so if you go into that world and suddenly, I can't stand that, and those people, they're so awful, and there's politics and the corporations, and they go, and they just totally wound up with this negative stuff. Well, that tells you they are not very spiritual people, because very spiritual people don't react that way. Those are fearful people.
Right.
And living through the drug experience doesn't help you get rid of fear. It just helps you feel like you're spiritual when in fact you are not. So that gives you a mask that prevents you from actually becoming spiritual. You see, now you're worse off than you were when you didn't know anything and were just starting out on square one. You're actually better off than you are after doing drugs for a long time. So that's the problems with drugs. They're very seductive in the sense that you feel more and bigger. Your reality's bigger because you've seen all this stuff. I've seen reality. I've been a part of the grass. I've been part of the trees. I've experienced being all with one. I know I'm just a piece of a larger thing. My dualism is gone. Da, 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 da. Well, it sounds very good, and it's all a lot of nice experience, and all of that experience is real. I'm not saying this is just an hallucination. It's all real, But like, okay, so what? How did that change you other than just make you feel, oh, wow, that's so cool. And I feel this way and that way. But it doesn't really change you as far as getting rid of your fear, getting rid of your beliefs, getting rid of your ego. You mostly change your beliefs. You don't get rid of them. You
Mm.
just reorient them in a different way. And they may be kinder and gentler beliefs. That's maybe true too, but it's still, that may make you a nicer person, but it doesn't help you grow up any. So that's the problem that I've seen with the people I know that do drugs on a regular basis.
True.
They tend to want to drop out. They tend to disengage. And how you grow up is by engaging, not
Yes.
disengaging. You got
Yes.
to engage with the world, connect with it. It's through those relationships, as interactions. Those are where you have the hard choices. Sitting in a circle with a bunch of your friends, in a lotus position isn't very challenging.
No.
It doesn't give you the kind of challenge that you really can grow up in. That's why, I always kind of, I talk about the yogi, who goes and lives in a cave, the ascetic who is a hermit. Well, he studies and he learns and he meditates 24 hours a day, and he feels very grown up, but he's eliminated himself from most all the challenges in life. Well, you can feel very grown up if you don't ever have any challenges in your life. That's his only challenge is to survive. He has to find food and shelter, and if he gets that under control, he really doesn't have any other challenges in his life. And mainly, they survive with food because people in their community come and drop food at the door of the cave. So, you see, with no challenges, it's easy to feel enlightened.
Yes, it's true.
But when you go out into the world, go elbow your way down a New York street and see how enlightened you feel. You see, if that annoys you because somebody just stuck their elbow in your ribs because they wanted to get in that door before you did, if that annoys you, then you got a lot of work to do
Mhm.
on growing up. So
Mhm.
we need that outside world. Engage in it. Don't drop out of it. That's, it's the same thing actually with the monks in their monasteries. If you have a bunch of monks in a monastery, my guess is that they grow up more slowly. It takes them longer to get there because they've put themselves in a cloistered environment that has very few, harsh consequences.
No
Oh,
obstacles.
yeah, there's not a lot of, well, they have to empty the latrine, they have to wash the dishes, they have to do the laundry, they have to take care, and there's all these jobs they have to do, but that's it. That's like the biggest sacrifice they need to make. So in that kind of a world, it's hard to grow up. It takes longer. It'll take you twice. You can grow up in that world. It's a place that you can grow up, but it's easier actually if you know what you're doing and you know what the world's all about. You can grow up better by engaging this reality, looking at your choices, getting rid of your fear, and being a person of love and caring and compassion while you're walking down that New York street.
That's
You
right.
see, and it doesn't upset you, and you don't get angry, and it isn't a problem for you, and you have a lot of compassion for the people that are around you because you see they're struggling. They're
Yeah.
struggling and struggling with their fear, with their issues, with their egos and their beliefs, and they're in this endless struggle. You can see it in their face. You can see it how they move. They're just locked into the struggling existence that they never seem to be able to quite get ahead. They almost make it, but it's always just out of their reach, and they struggle, struggle, struggle. And that is somebody who's full of ego, full of fear, full
Yeah.
of beliefs. That's what that fear, ego, and belief does to you. It makes your life a struggle. If you got
It's,
rid of it, your life wouldn't be a struggle. Your
it's
life would be easy. Synchronicity would drop everything you needed right in front of you just when you needed it. It changes everything. So yeah,
beautifully said.
I don't agree with go join a monastery if you want to become
Right.
spiritual.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
No, if you want to become spiritual, go get a job.
go get a job. Be in the world. Yeah, do something. Donate your time. Volunteer. Really
Yeah.
check out what the rest of the world is really all about. I mean, I'm really into that. Like, go volunteer somewhere and really see what's happening in the world. Engage. Yeah, totally. I agree with you there. You know,
Yeah.
this is my last question for you, and I think it's a really powerful one because I can't wait to see how you're going to answer this because I know it's just so good. So, if you had to choose a word to describe how to live a peaceful, productive life and to be of service to the world, what would that word be and why?
Well, the one word that's probably more powerful and sums up more things than anything else would just be the word love.
Yes.
But when you say love, when you say love, of course, people means, yeah, well, love what? What do you mean? And of course, love is about other. You see, love is not about self. If it's about you, it's not love.
Right.
Love is always unconditional. There's no such thing as conditional love. If it's conditional, that's ego. That's not love. Love is something you give away freely. It's not something that somebody has to earn. You give it away. It's yours to give away, and you have as much of it to give away as as you need or as you want. There's no limitation to the amount of love that you can give away. So love is the key thing. If you have to summarize, what is the most important concept, period, it would be the concept of love, of giving, of caring, and it's not acting loving. Again, we're not talking about acting. We're talking about being loving. You do those things. You care about people just because you care about people, not because you think you should care about people.
Right.
You see, that's the difference. So that's the key. That's the key ingredient in everything. That's what it boils down to. It's all about other, not what can I get here, what's in it for me, but how can I help? How can I serve? How can I help somebody else grow up? How can I help, whatever, the collective, all of us? That's what it's about. And that's what our mission is here. That's the answer to why are we here? We're here logged on to these avatars in this virtual reality to learn how to make choices on the side of love. So we make the choices because of love, because of our caring, because of our compassion. Those are the choices we're here to make. The opposite side of love, the direct opposite, is fear. Okay? Fear is very self-centered. Fear is all about me. And you make choices about you. What can I get? How can this affect me? How can I manipulate things to come out the way I want? How can I make sure that, my kids grow up and become doctors and lawyers? How do I make sure that my wife does this and that the way I want, or my husband doesn't throw his socks and underwear on the floor? How can I make my life be the way I want it to be? And that is fear.
Right.
You see, that's fear talking. So if it's about you, then it's about fear. And don't trick yourself, because a lot of people will say, well, I force my kids to do this and this because I love them. It's all about love. Well, no, it's about you. You need your kids to do that. You see, it's you. That's coming out of fear. You fear that your kids may crash and burn, end up druggies or, dysfunctional or unhappy, and you don't want that for them, and you fear it. So now you do these things.
Right.
But if you just love them, then you don't tell them what to do, unless they're very young. But if they're old enough, then you give them guidance, not direction. They have to make their own choices. So if you give them direction, do this, do that, oh, don't do that, no, I forbid you to do this, that is you imposing your free will on them and on their free will, and they will resent it. And they will probably, if they're teenagers, do exactly the opposite of what it is you forbid them to do. They'll have to do the opposite because they're trying to become their own person, and they can't, somebody else trying to manipulate them and be their person for them is just antithetical to what they're about in that phase of their life. So you will definitely force them into being what you don't want them to do if you try to tell them what to do. Right. You just need to give them guidance, but let them make the choices. And whatever choice they make, good, bad, or indifferent, you love them and you support them, and you don't say, I told you so. You just keep giving them guidance, particularly when they ask. Right. But, some people would say, well, my kids would never ask. I have to butt into that. That's not true. If you're not judgmental and you're not telling them what to do, they'll ask. They'll value your opinion because they know you're not going to tell them what to do. You're going to help them make a good decision, and they appreciate that. So the kids don't ask because they're afraid you're going to be judgmental and tell them they're wrong. Oh, that's wrong. You shouldn't do it that way. Just do what I tell you because I'm right and I know I'm older and you don't. So just do what I say. That's not helpful to them. They can't grow up that way. So they'll recoil from that. So they will come and ask you. You know, I had my kids would come ask me anything. You know, my daughters would come and, you know, ask me about sex and, you know, what should they do next? And this happened and that happened and so on. And for daughters to come to their fathers and talk about things like that is pretty bizarre in our culture. But they knew they could come talk to me because I would not judge them. I would not tell them, oh, you're a naughty girl for doing those things. You know, no, you back away from that. I wouldn't do that. I'd just basically say, well, here's the upsides, here's the downsides, here's the choices you've made, here's some of the places they might lead. And I made sure I found a little bit of good and bad in every choice. There was a little bit of something there that was positive and something that was negative in probably every choice, but let them weigh how much negative and how much positive was there in those choices. Let them weigh that out in all their choices, because there's almost nothing that's just pure black or pure white. Everything generally has some, you know, some gray and a little bits of white or little bits of black in it, places where you can get messed up or get caught. So I just outlined them the best I could and say, well, go back out in life and, you know, do the best you can. And they would be very grateful for that, because even if they decided to do what I thought would be the wrong thing, at least they'd have this information of mine that said, well, if you do it this way, expect this kind of thing would happen. And that may lead to that kind of thing, which would go there. And that's kind of the way that works. And if they start down that path and they see that first thing happening, then they see that second thing happening, well, they know they back out right away, because they know that third and fourth thing I told them about is on the way, and they don't want that. So it makes them smarter in being able to, you know, decide whether something's a good course or a bad course, or whether they're making good decisions or bad decisions more easily. But they have to figure that out on their own. So no, you can't say, well, I boss my kids around because I love them. You know, I boss my spouse around because I love them. You know, I do whatever. That's not it. If you boss people around, you're being arrogant and you're overrunning their free will, and you need to let them be whoever they are. And then you have to deal with whoever they are. Right. And if that's a problem for you, then discuss it, talk about it, but don't try to manipulate.
And it's beautifully said, because there's so many kids today that wish they had that kind of connection with their parent. I had that with my children always. I was a single mom, you know, raising my children on my own. It was always like, we're in this together, you know, let's talk about it. And you're never going to make a decision that, you know, I'm going to influence you. It's just not going to happen that way. You know, I want you to be your own person and come to me and be comfortable coming to me. And so many kids that grew up with my children always used to say, wow, I wish my parents would see it this way. You know, it would make my life that much easier. And you see these kids lying like crazy to their parents because they know that they can't communicate with them. And so it's so beautiful that you said this. And I think it's so important for my listeners to be hearing what you're saying about how to talk to your children, how to open up a relationship with your children, and how to make them feel secure in life and just be and make decisions on their own, make their own choices. I think it's beautiful that you said that. And wow, this is such a great way to wrap up this conversation with you today. I thank you so much. And I'm hoping maybe that, thank you for joining me here today. And I'm also hoping that maybe you'll come back again and do another, and definitely, we definitely want to promote your upcoming experiments and talk about how to reach out through the, it's not a GoFundMe, you said it, which?
No, Kickstarter.
Kickstarter, yeah.
It's going to be a Kickstarter. Probably come out sometime in mid-May, I would guess. We're going to maybe a little earlier than that. Our launch date now is like the 10th of May, but that could, you know, depend on how ready we are, that could move back. But in any case, yeah, we'd like to raise about $200,000, because that would pay for most of the experiments and get a video going. That's kind of our minimum thing. Anything more than that, we'll just do better on our documentary and more videos and more things that we can give out. But you know, everything we do is free. You know, we don't charge for anything. Everything goes out on YouTube. It's all free.
Right.
But even though we try to make it free, it's not necessarily free for us to produce it. So we need some resources in order to get it produced.
And this is a good way to really just keep moving this information out. You know, the more we get people to hear what you have to say and express this through this type of media, it's perfect, because it's just gonna grow roots, and just keep moving out. So wow. So all right, now to wrap this up, I'm just telling people, if they want to learn more about themselves through astrology, please contact me at my website, celesteonorati.com. If you'd like to get a copy of Tom's book, here it is, My Big Toe. Definitely go to his website. It's www.my-bigtoe, right? my-big-toe.com.
Right.
And, reach out to Tom.
And I'd like to add about that book is that if you don't want to pay for it, you can go to Google Books and read it for free.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's been out there from the very first 2003 when I first published them. I put it out on Google Books and made it 100% available. So it's a little hardship to read a book that way, sitting at a computer.
Right.
But if you can't afford it, or you just want to read it to a point to see whether you want to risk $25.50 for all 3 books, which is fairly cheap anyway, about $8 a book, then you can go to Google Books and you can get it for free. If you want to find out about more of the science end of it, go to YouTube, and you can probably get there easy. You can just go Google, My Big Toe or Thomas Campbell or something like that. But it's www.youtube.com/TWCJR44.
Yes.
Okay, so that will take you to the YouTube channel, but you can get there easier just through Google. I'll show up on the first page or 2.
Yeah, they're great.
In Google.
All the videos are great.
Yeah, and you'll find so many videos are overwhelming. I've got close to 500 videos out there now, and a lot of those videos are like an hour long, hour and a half long. So I got thousands of hours of video, but don't let that put you off. Just start any place, look at the topics and start someplace. And if it's long, well, watch it for 15, 20 minutes and pause it and come back the next day, and it'll come back up and restart at the same place, because Google now saves your place. So you can watch it over time.
Cool. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I always like to thank my listeners for joining in today. It's very important. They're the ones that are going to spread the word and talk about it and share it with their friends. And thank you again so much, Tom, for joining me on the Space Now today. And I definitely want to do this again with you, because this was a lot of fun. So,
it was a lot of fun, Celeste. Yeah, we can do it again.
Would love to. So thank you.
You're quite welcome.
All right. We'll see each other again.
Will do.
All right, Tom.